Charles Louis de Secondat was born on January 18, 1689, at the Château de la Brede, near Bordeaux, France, into a family of provincial nobility with deep roots in legal and administrative traditions stretching back generations. His mother died when he was 7 years old, leaving him to be raised in an environment that emphasized both aristocratic privilege and serious commitment to public service. Unlike Hobbes, who fled civil war and witnessed its horrors firsthand, or Locke, who participated directly in revolutionary politics and conspiracies against the English crown, or Rousseau, who challenged civilization itself from the margins as an outsider and self-educated provocateur, Montesquieu was thoroughly an establishment figure. He was born into power, educated for power, and expected to exercise power. In 1708, Montesquieu studied law in Bordeaux and then Paris. In 1714, he became a councillor in the Bordeaux Parliament, essentially a regional court with significant judicial and administrative authority. Then in 1716, he inherited from his uncle both the title Baron de Montesquieu and the prestigious position of Président à Mortier in the Parlement of Bordeaux, one of the highest judicial offices in the region. He was now part of France's noblesse des robes, the aristocracy of office, as distinct from the old military nobility. This gave him insider access to how power actually operated, how courts functioned, how laws were applied, how political maneuvering worked behind the scenes. He wasn't theorizing from the outside. He was observing from within the machinery of government itself. But Montesquieu was restless with routine legal work. His intellectual interests ranged far beyond adjudicating property disputes and inheritance claims. He studied natural science, conducted experiments, and wrote papers for the Bordeaux Academy on topics from the function of kidneys to why echoes are sometimes stronger at night. He had the Enlightenment's characteristic curiosity about everything. In 1721, he published Persian Letters, a satirical novel featuring two Persian travelers, Usbek and Rika, observing French society with bemused critical detachment. Through their supposedly naive foreign eyes, Montesquieu brutally critiqued absolute monarchy, religious intolerance, aristocratic pretension, and social hypocrisy. The book was published anonymously, wise given its sharp criticism of Louis XIV regime, but became an immediate bestseller, captivating Enlightenment Paris with its wit and social commentary. The success of Persian Letters established Montesquieu's reputation as a major intellectual figure, but his real ambition was larger and more systematic. He wanted to understand political systems scientifically, not as a moralist prescribing ideal governments based on abstract principles, but as an observer analyzing how different systems actually function in practice and why some preserve liberty while others inevitably collapse into tyranny. This empirical comparative approach set Montesquieu apart from most political philosophers. He wasn't starting from first principles about human nature or natural law. He was collecting data, observing patterns, analyzing what worked and what failed across different times, places, and cultures. In 1726, Montesquieu sold his judicial office, a significant decision that freed him financially and professionally. 2 years later, in 1728, he embarked on extensive travels across Europe that would fundamentally shape his political theory. He spent 3 years studying political institutions firsthand in Austria, Hungary, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, the Dutch Republic, and most importantly, England. He didn't travel as a tourist. He traveled as a researcher, systematically observing how different political systems operated. He attended parliamentary sessions, interviewed politicians and administrators, studied legal systems, examined how power actually functioned versus how it was theoretically supposed to work. He was gathering empirical evidence for the grand comparative study he was planning.
England fascinated him above all other countries. Why? Because it seemed to have solved a problem that plagued continental Europe. How to have stable, effective government that genuinely protected liberty without degenerating into either absolutism or chaotic anarchy. France had absolute monarchy, where the king's will was law. The German states had fragmented feudal authority with constant conflicts. The Italian city-states oscillated between republican government and tyranny. The Dutch Republic had republican institutions, but constant factional conflict that made governance difficult. England somehow had found a stable middle ground. It had limited monarchy, representative parliament, independent courts, and protection for individual liberties. English subjects enjoyed freedoms that continental Europeans could only dream of. Freedom of speech, freedom from arbitrary arrest, property protections, and genuine political participation for a significant portion of the population. How did they achieve this? That was the question Montesquieu set out to answer. Montesquieu returned to France in 1731, convinced he had discovered the secret: institutional design. England's liberty didn't primarily depend on having particularly virtuous rulers or uniquely enlightened citizens. It depended on how power was structured, divided, and balanced among different institutions that naturally checked each other through competing interests. For the next 17 years, Montesquieu worked on his masterpiece. The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, was massive. Over 600 pages divided into 31 books covering an enormous range of topics. Climate's influence on laws and customs, the relationship between commerce and government forms, the proper way to tax citizens, the danger of standing armies, the nature of political liberty, the relationship between civil and criminal law, the differences between republics, monarchies, and despotisms, the role of religion in society, and much more.
The book defied easy categorization. It wasn't a systematic philosophical treatise arguing deductively from first principles like Hobbes's Leviathan. It wasn't a polemical tract advocating revolution like Rousseau's Future Social Contract. It was something genuinely new, a comparative study of political systems analyzing what makes governments work or fail, drawing on examples from ancient Rome to modern Europe, from Persia to China, from small republics to vast empires. The Catholic Church immediately recognized the book's challenge to absolute monarchy and religious authority. They placed The Spirit of the Laws on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1751. But the intellectual momentum was unstoppable. The book became essential reading for anyone thinking seriously about politics, government, and constitutional design. It went through 22 editions in just 2 years. Montesquieu spent his remaining years defending and clarifying his ideas, though he never produced a systematic response to all its critics. He died in 1755 in Paris, 11 years before Rousseau's Social Contract would appear and decades before the American and French revolutions would attempt to implement Enlightenment political theories. But Montesquieu's ideas would prove more practically influential than any other Enlightenment philosophers. When French revolutionaries tried to implement Rousseau's radical direct democracy, they discovered it produced chaos, factionalism, and ultimately the terror. When American constitution makers followed Montesquieu's blueprint for separated powers and institutional checks, they created a stable government that has protected liberty for over 2 centuries. The question Montesquieu answered was this: how do you prevent tyranny through institutional design, rather than relying on impossible virtue, constant vigilance, or revolutionary upheaval? His answer: design institutions where power checks power through competing institutional interests became the foundation of modern constitutional government.